The HMS Hussar was a relatively small warship with 28 mounted cannons that was part of the British Royal Navy. She was built in England from 1761 to 1763, after which she was commissioned under Captain James Smith. The ship's early career was spent cruising around Cape Clear, Ireland, but she changed captains in 1767 when Captain Hyde Parker assumed command. Between 1768 and 1771, the HMS Hussar served the Royal Navy off the coast of North America. In March of 1771, she was decommissioned and became part of the Royal Navy's reserve fleet. The ship underwent repairs from 1774 to 1777, then recommissioned under Captain Elliot Salter in July of 1777. Once Captain Salter assumed command, the ship returned to North America for the later years of its service. During the Revolutionary War, the ship carried supplies and troops in America. By the middle of 1780, the Redcoats had a very unstable position in New York due to the alliance between the American Revolutionaries and the French. George Washington was proving to be a formidable opponent, and the British were forced to adapt. British Admiral Sir George Bridges Rodney took 20 naval vessels south of New York in November of 1780, which caused the British to decide to move the Army's supplies to Gardiner's Bay on Long Island. The idea behind this move was to relocate British supplies to a small island outpost on Long Island, where it would be less vulnerable to Washington and the French. It was on November 24th of 1779 when Captain Charles Pole decided to use a faster route to the new destination than had previously been used. Captain Pole's men warned him against using this route because it was such a treacherous stretch of water, but the captain ignored the warnings and opted for speed rather than caution. The HMS Hussar began sailing through Hell Gate, a narrow and dangerous channel between modern-day Manhattan and Long Island. During this voyage, the strong winds and tide forced the ship into a hidden obstacle called Pot Rock, a large rock just below the surface of the water. The ship sprang a leak and quickly started sinking, with the crew unable to stop the water from rushing in. They climbed aboard longboats and made it ashore, watching the water consume their ship and all of its cargo. The mysterious part of this incident comes in the aftermath of the sinking. Captain Pole was court-martialed for his mistake, but the record of the court-martial did not mention any payroll that had supposedly been aboard the ship. It even stated that whatever valuables may have been aboard the ship had been offloaded prior to the accident. However, many people suspected that the ship had contained a fortune. Some estimates claimed between $2 and $4 million worth of gold and silver, while others claimed upwards of $576 million worth of gold and silver. The survivors of the wreck denied it, and the cargo manifest made no mention of any such cargo, but many people remained suspicious. These suspicions only grew when the British Army conducted an extensive salvage effort of the ship, which they had claimed was devoid of any special value. The effort managed to recover some cannons and various pieces of the ship, but no valuables were found. The British used dynamite on the ship once their salvage effort had concluded. Despite the lack of evidence for the theory that the ship had been carrying gold and silver, recovery efforts continued for many years. A diver named Charles Pratt spent 13 years exploring the wreckage, where he discovered numerous artifacts such as swords, bottles, and even human skeletons that were still bound in shackles. These skeletons are believed to have been American revolutionaries who were captured by the British. In the 1930s, a submarine pioneer named Simon Lake spent a great deal of his money searching for the HMS Hussar, although he did not find anything noteworthy. In 2013, once Hurricane Sandy had battered the East Coast, parts of the ship washed ashore, but these parts consisted mainly of old wooden planks. Eventually, rumors began to circulate that an author named Robert Marks had salvaged coins from the wreckage, but he denied the rumors and stated that there was no evidence of any treasure being aboard the ship. To this day, the speculation about the cargo of the HMS Hussar remains. It seems most likely that the ship was simply relocating some basic supplies and prisoners to a better position, and the story was overblown, which turned it into a sort of legend. Nonetheless, people still wonder if the wrecked ship really did contain a massive wealth of treasure. Silas Deane was born on January 4th of 1738 in Groton, Connecticut to his namesake and mother, Hannah Barker. Deane's father was a blacksmith, but Deane did not want to follow his father's footsteps. He received a full scholarship to Yale, from which he graduated in 1758. With an impressive education under his belt, Deane's prospects grew considerably. In April of 1759, he was hired as a tutor for Edward Bancroft, who would go on to become a physician and chemist. Dean worked in Hartford, Connecticut with young Bancroft until 1761, when he was admitted to the bar and practiced law outside of Hartford. Before long, however, he ended his career in law and moved to Wethersfield, Connecticut, where he became a successful merchant. In 1763, Dean married Mehitable Webb, who had recently become widowed. They had a son named Jesse, but Webb died in 1767. Dean remarried in 1770 to Elizabeth Evarts, the granddaughter of a Connecticut governor. Evarts died in 1777, leaving Dean alone yet again. Despite the short-lived nature of both marriages, Dean's choice of brides had secured him some significant opportunities. His first marriage had allowed him to enter the West Indian trade business, while his second marriage expanded both his commercial and political influence. He was elected to the Colonial Assembly of Connecticut in 1768, and he continued to grow until he was chosen to be one of 3 delegates representing Connecticut at the First Continental Congress of Philadelphia. Between 1774 and 1775, Dean began to consider the prospect of separating from Great Britain. As time went on, he became more and more convinced that such a move was necessary, which prompted him to begin working behind the scenes to create an American Navy. He also worked to secure funds and supplies for the American revolutionaries to be able to capture Fort Ticonderoga. In fact, due to his role in the capture of the fort, Dean earned the nickname Ticonderoga from his colleagues. Dean looked up to George Washington as a great leader, and his support for the revolution was ironclad. However, his success in Congress created enemies back in Connecticut, where the Assembly refused to appoint him for a 3rd term. Nevertheless, Dean's impressive career was not over yet. Members of Congress approached him to offer an opportunity. Dean could travel to France in order to secure an alliance, which would provide the revolution with military and naval supplies against the British. Dean accepted the assignment in January of 1776. He used the disguise of a merchant who had come to France to purchase supplies for the American colonies, which would be traded with Native American tribes. Through this cover story, Dean made numerous connections, including contact with the French Foreign Minister Charles Gravier and a French businessman named Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais. The latter was an avid supporter of the American Revolution, and he helped Dean acquire French weapons from the Crown, which were secretly shipped back to American ports. Along with these efforts, Dean also managed to secure military commissions for several foreigners who supported the revolution. Some of these foreign supporters eventually became war heroes in America, but others ended up causing trouble for George Washington. In December of 1776, Congress appointed a 3-member commission to open formal negotiations with France. Dean's work had all been conducted in secret, but things were now changing. A combination of factors led to Dean's fall from grace. Several of the foreign commissioners caused more problems than solutions, and Dean's communications with America began to break down. Congress recalled Dean to America in 1777, believing that his string of successful ventures had come to an end. However, Dean had one last trick up his sleeve. In March of 1778, Dean joined Benjamin Franklin and Arthur Lee as the American representatives tasked with negotiating an alliance with France. If you know anything about American history, you know that these negotiations were successful, and the French became close allies with the American revolutionaries against Great Britain. Dean returned to America in July of 1778 aboard a French warship, which was a powerful message to his counterparts in the colonies. However, Dean soon found himself playing defense in front of Congress. He had left France without taking care of his finances, which made him vulnerable to criminal charges of profiteering. It was in August of 1779 when Dean was discharged from Congress and allowed to return to France in order to settle his finances. This would mark the beginning of the end for Dean's career. After returning to France, Dean waited for months to receive any communication from Congress, but there was only silence. His finances deteriorated, and he decided to move to Belgium in order to save money. After the British intercepted letters Dean had written to his friends, which revealed that his views on the revolution had changed, his popularity in the colonies dropped rapidly. Dean eventually moved to London in March of 1783, where he was soon visited by his old Connecticut friend, Benedict Arnold, the infamous traitor. Reports of this meeting between Dean and Arnold caused his dwindling political connections to completely renounce any attachment to him. Dean was left without any friends in America. In 1789, Dean's brother Barnabas urged him to return to Connecticut. Dean agreed and boarded a ship called the Boston Packet. However, shortly after leaving port, Dean became ill and perished. The ship returned to England and he was buried. This is where the mystery comes into play. In 1959, a historian named Julian Boyd suggested the theory that Dean may have been poisoned by Edward Bancroft, who himself had become a double agent during the war. Bancroft had spied on behalf of both America and Great Britain, which likely made him afraid that Dean would testify to Congress about his actions. Furthermore, Bancroft had spread rumors that Dean committed suicide, which contradicted the original account stating that he had succumbed to an illness. Nonetheless, Boyd's theory has been rejected by many in the years following its creation. There is no hard evidence to suggest that Bancroft murdered Dean. However, the theory of poisoning has been widely publicized in textbooks, making it, at the very least, another creepy legend from the American Revolution. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania was the site of a military hospital for American revolutionaries during the war. At the time, Bethlehem was a small town that was relatively unimportant until the hospital was opened. Shortly after it began servicing the wounded, the hospital experienced a large number of fatalities. The Continental Hospital was notorious for neglect and disease, which contributed to an estimated 500 to 1,000 dead soldiers. However, Bethlehem was not the only site of a hospital that killed as much as it saved. The town of Easton also contained a hospital for revolutionaries. Easton was described as poor and barren. It had a small population, but it also had strategic value. The only ferry for miles around that crossed the Delaware River was located in Easton, and there were many warehouses that were used to store military supplies. It was also a throughway between New York and Philadelphia. In December of 1776, Sergeant John Smith stayed in Easton with his company. During the time Sergeant Smith stayed in Easton, roughly 4,000 soldiers arrived in the town. Although they left quickly, an additional 3,900 troops came through the town in the following days. The companies also included numerous wounded and sick men, which put enormous strain on the local community, which barely had enough room for everyone, let alone the ability to heal the wounded and sick. At the same time as this was happening, George Washington had just suffered a defeat in New York, and he was in the process of retreating. Under his directive, numerous hospitals were being set up along his line of retreat. Washington ended up giving permission for even more hospitals to be taken over, including ones in Pennsylvania. This is when the hospital in Bethlehem began receiving wounded revolutionaries and churning out fatalities. The hospital in Easton was also taken over. Throughout winter and spring, the hospitals remained active, and Bethlehem lost 110 soldiers between December and March. The records of the hospital at Easton have been lost, but historians estimate that their losses were likely similar to those of Bethlehem. The reason for these losses was mainly due to smallpox and epidemic typhus, which spread quickly without the army having an adequate plan in place to isolate the infected. At this time in the war, Washington had not yet allowed inoculations, which could have saved many of the soldiers. Those who practiced inoculation before Washington gave his permission were arrested and hauled off to jail. By the middle of spring, Washington had officially permitted doctors to practice inoculation, and the hospitals in this area were finally emptying, providing Washington's forces with a significant number of additional troops. However, Easton's role in the war was about to greatly expand. By fall of 1777, British General William Howe was in the process of planning an invasion of Philadelphia. Washington moved his troops into defensive positions when he caught wind of this plan, but his efforts ultimately failed. The Redcoats defeated Washington and successfully captured Philadelphia, which resulted in massive amounts of wounded soldiers. The more seriously injured men who could not be moved were treated in field hospitals, but those who were stable enough to travel were sent to a variety of hospitals, including Bethlehem and Easton. The hospitals quickly filled up, and some of the sick and injured were forced to set up camp outside of the hospitals. During the month of November, Easton had more patients than any other hospital around. Carts with sick and wounded men continued to arrive at the hospital, which was practically overflowing. Wagons full of supplies and even British prisoners were also moving through Easton, which added yet more strain to the community. Due to a lack of resources, many prisoners starved and became ill. In fact, the Americans were shocked that the prisoners were not trying to escape. They were so malnourished and weak that they were simply complying with every order they were given. During this time, letters were sent to Washington from the head doctor in the area, Dr. Shippen, stating that everything was going well. Shippen was actively lying to Washington about the conditions of his hospitals. The hospital in Easton would finally close on March 27th as the war moved further south. A report stated that 110 patients had died while in the care of the Easton Hospital. As the war progressed, the hospital was opened once again and received many more patients. Easton also received many more prisoners, and historians have estimated that at least 300 people perished in Easton, including both American revolutionaries and British prisoners. However, this brings us to the mystery behind this case. The graves of the Easton dead have never been found. Modern-day Easton is much more urban and populous than it was during the war, and historians have speculated that construction efforts likely turned up many graves, which went unreported. For all intents and purposes, the hundreds of dead in Easton have been lost to history.